Without delay, acknowledge that here in Canberra, we're coming to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and we acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. And we pay our respects to First Nations people on the lands where you all are and where you're joining us from. So it's my very great pleasure to welcome Professor Ian Hall with us today, who will be speaking to the title Interpretive International Relations, Narrative and Explanation. We very much look forward to your talk. Ian, if you want to just share your slides if you have them.
April, thank you so much. Thanks very much also to you and to Nick for the invitation to speak to you all today. Apologies again for being a little bit late. And apologies for what is, I suppose, a kind of a flippant initial slide. But I wanted to talk about stories, and I wanted to talk about narrative, and I wanted to talk about how narratives explain things, even if sometimes those narratives might misexplain a particular phenomenon. And here you've got, for those of you who've got children or have had anything to do with reading or watching the TV series of the Gruffalo, you'll be kind of conscious of the fact that sometimes narratives can mislead. And even with the best of intentions, we can end up with explanations for things, discussions of things, of phenomena that we see that get things wrong. But I don't think that's any different, or I don't think that narrative is any different to any other kind of form of explanation in this sense. So I'll come back to the Gruffalo theme a little bit later on in what I'm going to say today. So look, let me just also kind of start with one other apology, which is that I'm going to talk about something today which has kind of nagged at me and annoyed me for the best part of, well, too long, really, more than 20 years. Something, and I have this warning, I suppose, which is that, you know, one of the things you mustn't try to do is get nagged by something for over a long period of time without actually addressing it and dealing with it properly. But this is one of these things, and this was an opportunity to talk about something that has bothered me for a significant period of time, and also to talk about how I've thought through that thing that's bothered me, and not to a particularly good conclusion, I will admit, over the last 20 years or so, of not so much focusing on methods, but more in doing studying politics, specifically studying international relations, and increasingly over the last few years as well, looking particularly at India's international relations, so looking at a very kind of practical area of international relations. Okay, so let me also just put into one more caveat to this. Some of you might know that my academic career kind of started off as a historian, so specifically doing medieval history. One of the fun things about doing medieval history is you don't have an enormous amount of evidence for certain things, but you also sometimes have a lot of evidence for one thing, but on one particular topic, for example, or addressing one particular issue. Or a lot of that evidence could be invented, or it can be prejudiced in some way, or it can be biased in some way. And then you don't have any evidence at all for really important things that we kind of know are there, and we can't really easily explain. And so we have to kind of make all of these bridges across the evidence or between pieces of evidence, and we have to make a whole bunch of different, we have to essentially draw in other kinds of theory, other kinds of explanations, sometimes from other fields, in order to explain things that we know happened, but for which we have really imperfect kinds of evidence. So speaking as somebody who used to be a medieval historian, and so dealt with, not with the world of the modern historian, where there's huge amounts of evidence for everything, but rather as somebody who had to then construct narrative about and construct explanations about things for which we often don't have a lot of evidence, or the evidence we have is really imperfect. So first thing is that, so I want to say, I am going to think through and talk about international relations and talk about the work that I do in terms of, to some degree, referring back to what I learned when I was a historian. And then when I did my master's degree and PhD, I kind of moved fields into international relations. But there are some, and as I say, like at the beginning there, there's a warning, which is that sometimes importing assumptions from one field to the other can be helpful, and sometimes they can't be. And then the second thing is this issue of, fussing about things that annoyed you. So the thing that annoyed me was really this book, actually. It's an excellent book in lots of ways, written by two excellent scholars. But what it does is it makes this very stark contrast between two different things. So it makes the stark contrast between explanation and understanding. It's not a contrast that Hollis and Smith kind of invented out of nothing. It's a contrast that is there in some of the earlier work on the social sciences. It's kind of there, for example, in Max Weber's work. It's there in William Drey's work on historiography a little bit later on. It's there all the way through the 1950s, 1960s, 70s. But they pose this kind of stark divide between explanation and understanding. And what they argue is that understanding is what they call an inside perspective, explaining phenomena from the inside in terms of what the agents involved in something, in some social group, in some kind of institution or whatever else it is, how they see things from the inside, trying to get at that understanding that they have, and then trying to, understand their understandings, if you like. And they also argue that this understanding is holistic in some sense, in that it focuses on the web of social rules around some kind of phenomenon or some sort of place or some institution or some thing. Then they also say, well, we can also do individualist understanding, which focuses more on how individual agents see what they're doing, interpret their behavior, how they understand the meaning of their actions, which in the end is what interpretivist research is really all about, is trying to understand the meaning that actions have for agents, whether individually or collectively. So they contrast explanation with understanding, and they say, understanding is a perfectly valid thing, and it can be done in different ways. It can be done at a kind of macro level, and it can be done at an individual level, and it can be done at lots of levels in between. So they say understanding is a kind of perfectly legitimate thing, but then towards the end of the book, there's some kind of, the argument tends to kind of be skewed in one particular direction. And the argument is skewed in the direction of saying, well, look, understanding is good and we can do understanding, but in the end, explanation is kind of probably a little bit better. And it equates explanation with a kind of positivist understanding of the social sciences, where explanation is about a value-free kind of project. You're establishing what Drey and others called covering laws. Sorry, I just gone quickly. So we're establishing like covering laws, in other words. So there's this kind of sense in which explanation is elevated slightly higher than understanding, and saying that interpretive approaches that are kind of just mere understanding, and that there's a higher order of doing social science which involves explaining rather than just merely understanding what social groups do in terms of the meaning that the actions have for them, or what individuals do. Okay, so I hope that kind of makes sense in terms of, I'm reacting against something which I recognize is now a book that was published 33 years ago, but it's a book that was well read during the 1990s and 2000s. And I think it embodies a set of assumptions about, particularly in international relations, that suggests that that understanding is a lesser kind of activity to explain. And we sort of see this running through the social sciences. Now, it's not to say, of course, and I'm talking to some extent to the converted here, it's not to say, of course, that people aren't interested in interpretive work of various different kinds. I and others in this room have written much better work than I have on this particular approach to thinking about social sciences, to studying society in its broadest terms. So there's been plenty of interpretive work that's been done, and there's been plenty of interpretive work that's been done in my field, international relations, as well. And at the same time, too, there's also been an enormous amount of interest in narrative. So I just took this graph, this engram from Google, and of course, as you know, if you do a word search, it goes through Google Books, and it just searches for those particular search terms, and you can get a sense of the frequency in which those terms are being used. And one of the striking things is that if we go back to 1990, when Hollis and Smith was published, and we track that out to almost to today, to 2019, we can see there's been an enormous growth in narrative politics as well. So it's not that narrative per se is being neglected, and it's not that interpretive approaches are being neglected, but rather that, as I'm going to say, we're kind of interested in other people's narratives without being interested in narrative for our own modes of explanation. So that's the kind of the argument that I want to get at today. So huge amounts of interest in narrative politics, very legitimate activities, huge amounts of really interesting work that's been published, and in various different forms as well. So, you know, we have a journal of narrative politics now, which, you know, to my mind, focuses quite a lot on autoethnography, as well as looking at the narratives of others about political action in its broadest terms. There are lots of textbooks. There are many, many articles that have been published on narrative politics. And the concerns of these articles and books and so on are really, I think, two things. One is looking at the narratives or the stories that states and social groups and sometimes individuals as well tell themselves, that then shape their identity. And then if we argue that their identity somehow shapes their behavior, we can then look at these narratives in order to try to understand that behavior to some degree, or even explain that behavior to some degree, by linking together the stories that social groups tell themselves to conceptions of identity, and therefore also then on to particular policies or particular behaviors, particular actions, and so on. And then the other concern that we have, which is linked to this, is how we experience politics and international relations. And that can be how, quote unquote, ordinary people and the everyday experience of international politics, but it can also be how we as scholars experience international politics. And we've seen that the rise and the emergence of autoethnography, particularly, you know, Roland Bleicher and other people have written on this in international relations, and it's mirrored in lots of other fields as well. We've seen the rise of autoethnography as a means of reflecting upon the experiences and the positions and so on of scholars themselves, and then trying to reflect also on how that then shapes the way they interpret the world of politics and international relations beyond them. So looking at their personal experiences, but then also reflecting on the broader experience, if you like. So no lack of interest in narrative, no lack of interest really in interpretive approaches, but I think, and here's the case that I want to make, is we're less interested in then using narrative to convey the findings of our results, and we're also less interested, or we're not positive enough in arguing that narratives are a very good way of explaining things, and that the explanations that we get from narratives are just as good as the explanations that we might get from other kinds of social science, which aim at other kinds of explanations, such as covering laws or kind of general findings of that kind. Okay, so narrative politics, the interest in narrative politics, I think, is extremely well grounded. It does recognize that, as many people have argued for some time now, we are unusual as creatures, in the sense that we make sense of ourselves, we make sense of our interactions with others, we make sense of the lives that we live, of our pasts, of our futures, and so on, in terms of telling stories to ourselves, telling stories to others, to public audiences, to private audiences, and so on. So we are, as Paul Ricoeur and others have argued, we are storytelling animals. So narrative politics is well grounded in saying, in this sense of that recognizing this basic fact, if you like, and that we tell lots of different kinds of stories, and we often tell stories about politics, whether it's interpreting the meanings of what we do, or whether it's covering up the meanings of the actions that we have, or the consequences of the actions that we've engaged in, or indeed it's interpreting the meanings of actions and consequences of other people as well. We are also, of course, tell stories about our own personal behavior, our voting behavior, or our interactions with political elites, or interactions with states or others, and so on, as well. And then, of course, we do tell stories to motivate. And narrative is crucially important to getting people to do things, to change their behavior, to act differently, to vote in a different way, to change their lives in some meaningful sense. So we're telling stories for lots of different reasons, to make sense of our world, to make sense of ourselves, to sometimes to justify our actions, sometimes to undermine the justifications of others, and sometimes to persuade others to do things. And we've got somebody like Ronald Reagan, who is well known as a great storyteller and as a great narrative politician, I suppose. So, and to be more specific than that, we've seen a growth of interest in various different kinds of narratives and various different kinds of uses of narratives. So, I've already kind of touched on the in international relations is particularly interested in this, in public and state narratives, things that shape national identity and then also go on and shape behavior. Public policy scholars are a little bit more interested in debates between narratives. You see that to some degree also in international relations and debates about foreign policy, but it tends to be more in public policy that we see this discussion about narrative contestation, how particular narratives win out in public policy discussions at an elite level, at an everyday level, an ordinary level. All of those things are happening as well. We've got a lot of interest, I think, in narratives of experience, in terms of trying to say that experiences of politics and political behavior, interpretations of actions and meaning of actions, all of these kinds of things, we have sort of dominant theories of why that explain the meaning of those things, but they might not, in fact, reflect the understandings that everyone else has, particularly non-elite actors might have, diverse actors might have, about their behavior and the behavior of others as well. So we've seen a lot of interest in that, trying to get a sense of the different kinds of lived experience and how that intersects with politics in a broad sense. And then I've already said, we've got a great amount of interest in autoethnography because it allows us to think about positionality and lived experience as well. Okay, so here I think we kind of, so in other words, what I've tried to argue then is we've got a huge amount of interest in interpreting things, we've got a huge amount of interest in interpreting narratives, and so we've got a huge amount of interest in narrative politics in a broad sense. But our dominant concern really within the academy, and certainly I think within international relations, is that we're interested in other people's narratives, but we're a little bit leery about using narrative itself as not just as a means of interpreting or understanding. In other words, not just looking at someone else's narrative and then saying, look, this is an example of somebody interpreting their own behavior, and then explaining that behavior in terms of that narration. But we're a little bit leery of actually narrating things ourselves and using narrative to explain things. So we use narrative a lot of the time to understand, to interpret others' behavior. But then when we go to kind of explaining some phenomenon in politics, we are not using narratives ourselves. We kind of use other sorts of explanations. Hopefully, I'm kind of make this distinction make some sense. And I want to kind of ask the question as to why we do that and why we're a bit leery of narrative as explanation, when there are not particularly good grounds to push narrative to one side and just simply say, oh, it's not valid. It's okay for ordinary people, but it's not okay for us as scholars to use narrative to explain things. Instead, what we've got to try to do is create some kind of generalizable knowledge, some general theories about things that then we can, and that's the kind of higher level finding of our research. Rather than saying actually a good narrative that draws upon lots of other things, not the evidence that we have in front of us, but also, general findings of other kinds of research. And a good narrative that puts all of those things together is something that I think we're still a little bit fearful of, at least in my field of international relations. So if you submit, work that is mostly narrative in form, that attempts to explain some phenomenon, you can often get into trouble with book publishers, with journal articles, and so on. Instead, what we're looking for is some sort of higher level general findings, covering laws, if you like, in that older language of positivism. Okay, so why is that? Why are we in this situation? I think there's really a couple of different explanations for this. One is that we've even interpretivists and even people who don't do positivist work have kind of internalized an element of positivism in their own view of the world. And it's clear, I think, in that Hollis and Smith book that I saw you talked about at the beginning, that sense that Hollis and Smith get to the end of their book and they say, you know, understanding things is a perfectly legitimate activity, but there's still that lingering sense that explaining things is more important, and that explanation is done through covering laws, essentially, through coming up with general explanations for phenomena that hold across different periods, different places, different people, and so on. So this kind of outdated positivism and what I think is kind of natural science envy, aiming for general explanations of phenomena, is there, I think, in Hollis and Smith, but it's become internalized within political science, it's become internalized within international relations. And you can see it in other places too. So if you look at King, Cohane and Verber's, you know, very famous book on methods, you see there that even though their focus is on qualitative work, there's still this insistence that qualitative work arising from case studies or other kinds of work is, you know, the kinds of causal arguments that you can make from that kind of work are not as good as large N quantitative studies, which rely, because they draw on more and more cases, they therefore must be superior to the qualitative work that is done that can only necessarily focus on particular instances or a low number of cases. The other thing that I think is problematic in the field as well, and I kind of accept that a lot of this discussion is a bit of a complaint, is a big whinge from my part, and I'm sorry about that. The other thing that I think we're excessively concerned with theory. And this is, you know, the more work that I do in the field, the more I get frustrated that we kind of spend a lot of time debating theory, and we don't spend a lot of time, enough time really, looking at things that are happening in the political and the international space. And they can be things that are close to us, and they can be things that are far away from us, then they can be elite things and everyday things. I'm not saying that we should be doing one or the other or more of one or the other, but rather I think we just spend a lot of time thinking about where we fit theoretically and about advancing theory instead of, in fact, giving us better explanations of things that happen, which I think personally is more interesting, and I also think is what we should be doing more of. And so to illustrate this obsession with theory thing, I just got this fantastic, somebody, I think some students created this fantastic flowchart that I've given the credit there on the website, you know, to try and explain the fragmentation, if you like, of international relations theory. And that flowchart there doesn't even cover all of the full spread of various theories that exist within just the subfield of politics that is international relations. And so, you know, I think that the fact that we've seen this extraordinary fragmentation and that we're all conscious of foregrounding our isms in the way that this graph kind of does, just illustrates to some degree this obsession with theory and this kind of lack of balance towards thinking about things that are happening in the world and empirical developments. All right, so I think thinking about using narrative to explain rather than studying how others explain things through narrative is something that we might do, and I think it's something that might help us to get beyond some of these other problems. So these disciplinary fixations, I think, are really peculiar because, you know, it's only really in fields like political science, academic fields like political science, that narrative is not accepted as a mode of explanation. So in other areas that have in society that are considered, you know, authoritative, we see narrative being used frequently. So here, for example, even if we look at research, even in the natural sciences, as Hidemi Suganami pointed out, more than a decade ago, 15 years ago, he looked at natural science articles and noted that if you go and read something in Nature or Science or whatever else, the explanations that are there will be a narrative saying, we started here and we ended there, and through the middle of all of that there will be references to various different general findings or covering laws about social scientific or natural scientific phenomena. But the core, the way that the phenomenon is explained is through a story that is told of the work that is done and the findings that are found and the temporal linkages between the first thing, the second thing, the third thing, and all of those sorts of things. Okay, so narrative, in other words, is ubiquitous in the natural sciences, and yet we're kind of leery of it in the social sciences. And then also, if we look in other areas of social life, we find that not just that we're constantly interpreting ourselves and others and things that we see and explaining those to ourselves and others in terms of stories, but that also some kinds of narratives are considered socially authoritative. And so here I've become increasingly interested, for reasons that are obvious from the photograph there, in legal indictments and legal judgments, where these are very, very clear uses of narrative to explain how a crime was committed, how a particular act occurred, to explain the motivations of the actors, to explain whether or not this thing is more likely or less likely, whether we can infer from this piece of evidence that this thing might be true, and so on. So there's a whole bunch of other things that those narratives will reference, but the form of those indictments and the form of those judgments are essentially narrative. They're narratives that explain things. And here's a good example of that. So here's one of the indictments against Donald Trump, and you can see here how it starts. How we have a story beginning in the introduction, saying, here we have introducing a character, introducing the office of the character. Who is this person? What office do they hold? What role do they play? What were they doing at the time at which we sort of begin this story? And then the kind of the crux of the story, which is that in this case, the defendant lost the election. And then despite having lost, the defendant was determined to remain in power. So in those 3 sentences right at the start there, we're setting up a story, and we're giving an indication of the arc of the story, the beginning and the end of this. And then in the remainder of the indictment there's an attempt to lay out stage by stage, point by point, running temporarily from the beginning to the end, explaining each move that was made, and explaining the evidence that suggests that X is true or Y is false, and so on and so forth. So these indictments are very clear uses of narrative to explain things. And as I say, they're considered to be socially and legally, officially, governmentally authoritative things. So these legal narratives, I think, show that explanatory narratives are not just stories, right? Stories that we care about, of course, stories that we're interested in. The growth of interest in narrative politics has illustrated that. But they're not just stories that people tell because they are storytelling animals. It is actually the case that explanatory narratives are valid ways of conveying an explanation as to why something happened, which in the end is one of the fundamental things that we need to do in political science or in international relations or related fields like that. So what do? They use known facts. They establish those facts by rigorously testing all the available evidence, comparing and contrasting all the various different bits of evidence that can be acquired through testimony or through wiretaps or through a whole range of different things, and all of that evidence is tested, and things that are inconsistent are explored, and so on. So there's a whole process of establishing what those facts are prior to them being then included in the narrative. They proceed obviously logically and chronologically, but really importantly, these legal narratives are not chronicles. So they're not an account of what a defendant did from 9 o'clock in the morning all the way through till 5 o'clock. They focus, as good historical narratives do, on the meaningful things, the things that are important during the day, the week, the year, or whatever else it is. So they abridge time and they abridge experience to focus on the meaningful and the consequential, and they proceed chronologically in that sense. They also, of course, draw upon relevant theory and also in some ways, covering laws. So, for example, they might draw on, psychological theories of behavior, or they might draw also on, scientific findings about DNA evidence or whatever else it is. They can draw upon a whole multiple different kinds of knowledge and multiple different kinds of theory in order to inform that narrative. But the point of the explanation that's in the narrative doesn't just rely on pointing to one generalizable finding. And of course, these legal indictments and so on test alternative narratives too, informed by theories and laws and so on and so forth. Okay, so we have, good examples in other fields of using narrative, not just to understand something, but to actually explain some phenomenon, and to do so, though, in a way that is attentive to meaning, that is attentive to human beings as agents, as world-making agents to some degree or another, as agents that live in a social world of meaning that they are constantly interpreting and they're constantly adding to and constantly negotiating. All of that is possible to encompass in these kinds of narratives. And so I argue here that there's no real reason why we shouldn't encompass them in our own ways, in our own fields. Okay, so what are the problems then? I think what I tried to identify through all of this. So if we look at international relations, for example, we've got, some issues. I've already commented on the lingering positivism and the obsession with theory, but I think there's also a misunderstanding of what narratives are or do, and the sense in which narratives are good for other people, but they're not necessarily good for us. I think too, the other thing that any discussion of this focuses on is that as a field, and here I'm just talking about international relations more than political science, we are still very interested in structure and not so much in agency. But if you explain phenomena in terms of in narrative form, it in a way, I argue, kind of compels you to look back at agent motivation and to start to take human agency more seriously and start to take the ways in which agents kind of imbue the social world with meaning of their own, and also imbue their own actions with meaning as they act politically in the world. So that lingering attachment with structuralism, which is something you see very much in Alexander Wendt's social theory, and a lot of the constructivist work that we've seen appear over the last 20, 25 years or so, that lingering attachment to structuralism, which is really about replacing material structures with other kinds of social structures, and then arguing that those social structures to some degree limit or contain or even drive human agents into doing certain things, and ignoring the fact that agents actually have a significant capacity to reinterpret the social world that they have around them, and that certain social actions may have multiple different meanings for multiple different people. So the lingering attachment to structuralism neglects all of those kind of underlying kinds of problems. And then the last problem I think we've got, so in international relations in particular, is the kind of lack of ambition. So we've become to some degree obsessed with coming up with general explanations for particular phenomena, but the phenomena that we're focusing on are kind of smaller and smaller and smaller and less and less and less significant. And of course, the fragmentation of theory at the same time has also exacerbated this problem. That's one kind of disciplinary pathology that leads to lack of ambition. And then the last one, which is a really common one, which you hear a lot in the field of international relations, is is that it's really just impossible to understand why agents are motivated, and particularly politicians and officials. So official political actors. There's it's a view that's summed up in the rather in the awful John Mearsheimer's argument that that leaders lie, and that therefore we should just discount what leaders say. We should discount what leaders write. We should discount this kinds of off-the-cuff remarks that they might make, and that we can't, and we have no means of using that as evidence for explaining their behaviour. All right, let me wind up then. So I'm going to finish up by just saying, I think there are others that have trod this ground, okay? And I'm not pretending that what I'm saying here is particularly original. There's no good reason, as Hidemi Suyanami said 15 years ago, that we shouldn't be in fact interested in what decision makers think, or how they interpret their actions and the processes that lead to their decisions. So there's nothing wrong with being interested in structures, in social structures, or intersubjectively created structures, or even in material structures. But we can also be interested in what individuals and agents are doing as well. And if we want to capture what they're doing and why they're doing it, and we want to understand their behavior and then explain their behavior, we can do that, and we can use narrative in order to do that. And I think so. My kind of plea here is to say that, look, as a field, international relations can aim a lot higher than this. So we don't just have to look for those. We can incorporate general theories, of course, but we can also look at agent motives. There are ways, tried and tested ways of assessing those things, which lawyers have no problem with and others have no problem with, but we, for some reason or another, find it hard to do. So why not be more ambitious, combine these things, and use narrative to explain? I'll leave it there. Thank you, April.